slope. So there. I don't know how much closer we can get. It should be okay. Do that. Should be alright. Yeah, turn it there. So they'll, yeah, so see where they come up to and there, and then just leave it there. Live. No.
Well, as soon as she's take part in the process, we have
Morning. Steve, why don't you sit on the end there, and Jill, why don't you come here? I'll take that one. Sarah can sit here. Sarah, you sit here. I'll take that. Oh, are you able to say anything about
Oh, no, I'm not yet. Yes and no. I'm not allowed to say yet publicly, I'm afraid, because the letter goes today to Dido. It goes to the Minister and it's published. So I can't say until it's published, I'm afraid.
the letter has gone?
And she will know today. But I'm sorry, I can't say.
No, absolutely understand. It's just we're keen to get involved.
Good morning. Can I call us to order and welcome you, and welcome many of you back to the King's Fund. Thanks for joining us promptly for this first seminar in a new series of breakfast seminars we're running at the Fund. First, that is after the election, seems a long time ago now, after the party conferences, and you know that we're focusing today on what a minority government might mean for the future of the NHS and for social care. Brexit is clearly the dominating issue post the election under the minority government, and that has implications for a whole range of domestic and other public policy issues. So we thought it'd be really helpful to get a slightly different lineup of speakers to help us today, people we don't often have at the Fund, but we're delighted when they accept our invitation to join us. So you will know that Steve Richards, a political commentator, journalist, we read in many different places, will set the scene by describing the broader political context. Sarah Wollaston, Chair of the Health Select Committee, will then follow on, offer her reflections on the issues in relation to health and social care in particular. And then Jill Rutter from the Institute for Government will complete the lineup of speakers, offering a view as to what's going on in Whitehall, how the machinery of government may or may not be responding, what we can learn perhaps from previous minority governments, because we've been here before, although not quite in the context we're in today. So 3 speakers, each short contributions, around 5 to 8 minutes was our guidance, and then plenty of time for questions and discussion. We'll be finishing very promptly at 9:45 this morning. We're also, you can see the technology, live streaming today's event for people who can't join us, be able to follow us on the live stream, and there'll be a recording available afterwards. The other final thing I want to say is it's an exciting day for us, because the new updated version of our alternative guide to the National Health Service, that's probably one of our most viewed, if not the most viewed pieces on our website, is going to be released today. In fact, I think probably has already been released. Very much at the end of this session I will show you what that looks like, and hopefully you'll be able to access it on the website during the course of today or whenever's convenient. So thank you again for joining us and coming back to the fund if you've been here before. I'm really pleased to invite now Steve Richards to open up our discussions this morning. Steve.
Thank you very much. I'll just set my stopwatch to make sure I don't overrun. Chris, thank you very much indeed. The last time I spoke at a gathering at the King's Fund was shortly before the 2015 general election. And my brief then was to address the question whether there could be in that election, and therefore subsequently, a grown-up debate about health and social care, the financial implications, the structural implications. And I said with total confidence and without any qualification that any hope for a grown-up debate, forget it. The 2015 election would be fought on the usual fantasy tax and spend games, and even though people like Andy Burnham at the time, then Labour's health spokesman, was urging his leadership to be more grown up in public, I knew for sure that they wouldn't feel able to do so. And so we had a fantasy election in 2015 about who would meet the deficit target first. The deficit target was never met, and there was no grown-up discussion in that election about health and social care. The tragedy about the 2017 election, a wholly underexplored dimension of it, is that in its own erratic, eccentric way, it broke this tedious pattern of fantasy tax and spend elections. Theresa May, wholly ineptly, but on one level bravely and admirably, broke that pattern, and in a very different way, Jeremy Corbyn and John McDonnell did as well. It was the first election fought around questions about how do we pay for social care, who pays, in what form. Now, the tragedy took 2 forms, and it's going to set this debate back, I fear, many decades. One was that Theresa May, by calling the early election in a kind of Shakespearean way, unleashed forces that turned on herself. She was wholly unsuited to put the case for radical change. That manifesto, if you read it now, remains an extraordinary document in many ways. There she was parading a series of radical and in some ways ill-judged proposals, and all she could talk about was strong and stable leadership. The gap between the need to prepare the ground and explain and her own projection was darkly comic. And therefore, nearly all Conservative MPs I've spoken to have already reached the conclusion you cannot be candid at a general election about the cost of, say, funding elderly care. The fact that it was the wrong proposition, that it wasn't around pooling of risk, but allowed opponents to call it a dementia tax, was part of the problem. But the problem now is perceived as being, you can't do any of this in an election campaign. And if you can't do it in an election campaign, it prevents you doing it once you've won or lost that election campaign. The other great problem is that because she lost her overall majority in that campaign, she has lost all authority and all practical means to contemplate anything radical or daring at all. From planning, albeit wrongly, but sensibly in theory, for a framework to provide for social care and to some extent address some of the structural issues in its relationship with the NHS and so on. There was no reference to it whatsoever in the Queen's speech of any significance. And so instead, from an attempt at a more grown-up debate at an election, we move to the haphazard politics of a hung parliament. Now, haphazard politics is not always, for the NHS, a catastrophe. It means for sure there will be no sensible planning, there will be no thoughtful reforms, because instead of thinking or saying within number 10 or the Treasury, for sure, or indeed the Department of Health, what do we need to do and how do we do it, the first question they all pose neurotically is, will this be defeated? Can we get this through the House of Commons? So do not expect in this hung Parliament a series of coherent reforms or proposals for you to either support or oppose. No one will have the space to do it, partly because of that energy-sapping Brexit, but also because of the fear of defeat when anything contentious comes up. But that very fear of defeat means, it seems to me, that this very precarious government, and in my view, in one respect, it's more precarious than the last minority government we had for a long period of time, which was the Labour government between 74 and 79. In effect, it began a minority government, ended one. This one is weaker because at least that Labour government was perceived to have sort of won when it took over. It replaced a Conservative government. This one is perceived to have lost but has carried on in power. And it seems to me that puts it in a weak position. And with Brexit again sucking up all energy, I don't think it can afford a vivid NHS crisis. Now, by vivid, I'm sure many of you in the room already have concluded the NHS is in crisis. But a winter crisis where the Daily Mail has front pages of the NHS in disarray. That was, by the way, what triggered the Labour funding increase announced on David Frost's sofa one Sunday morning by Tony Blair. This government can't do it. And even if it was inclined to force its way through the storms of that kind of media campaign, it takes very few MPs concerned about their increasingly small majorities in a number of seats to make sure something is done. So even if Philip Hammond, who is a technocrat rather than a great political thinker, doesn't announce in a clear way a series of increases beyond what is already announced, there will be, my guess, at certain points, emergency injections of cash, because in a hung parliament, a government can only survive if it addresses the concerns at the very least of its MPs and indeed its few supportive newspapers. So be prepared for a bumpy ride, one wholly dominated by Brexit. Under normal, sane circumstances, health and social care would be the number one issue. It's hardly taking up any attention at all. It should do, but only will do, as I say, at moments of crisis for this minority, in effect, minority government. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Steve. Now Sarah's going to lift our spirits.
only. I think that Steve has delivered the speech that I was going to give, because I think that his appraisal of the situation is absolutely right. And I think there is a grave danger, because at this stage in a government is normally the time when you can get constructive cross-party working to deliver things. The closer you get to an election, the more difficult that becomes. And the problem at the moment is, because things feel rather fragile, I think the Corbyn feels that we should be on an election footing permanently. And this is going to hamper all those attempts, I feel, at cross-party working. Because the other issue here is that with a hung parliament, the only way that you can get things done is by consensus and cross-party working. So that is the thing that worries me. And the other point that worries me has already been touched on by Steve, that all the energy is being consumed by Brexit at the moment and how that is going to be delivered. And I think that's the great tragedy. And above all this, we all know, all of us in this room, people sense it outside, that what we have to do is get on and deliver sustainable long-term funding for health and social care. We are going to see a green paper on social care. My view is that this is an opportunity missed, because we should be looking at health and social care together. Because one thing's very clear to me, wherever I speak, if I ask people whether they would be prepared to pay more for the health service, it's always a yes for the majority of people. If you ask people about social care, it's a different answer, because people don't really start thinking about social care until it affects them and their family. If I go to an audience and I ask people, how many people in this room have either personally used the NHS in the last year or a member of their close family? It's really the vast majority. If I ask people, have you or a member of your family or somebody you really care about used social care, it's not. And I think that sort of typifies why people's attention is always on the NHS, but it tends not to be on social care until the last minute. And so by bringing the two together, not only do you help to deliver sort of public support, but also it's the right thing to do, because we can't keep separating health and social care. I know that there are great complexities because of the different funding model, one being free at the point of use and the other means tested, and bringing those two systems together is enormously complicated. Kate Barker and the King's Fund, their commission showed us a sensible route forward that we could have moved slowly towards an integrated system. But politically delivering that is enormously challenging. And that became very clear to me in the election campaign. I was going around, and street after street, every single household, every door I knocked on, told me that they were supporting Theresa, because it was a very personalised campaign. We're behind Theresa. And then came the social care funding announcement, and it was like falling off a cliff. The fox hunting issue didn't help, I can tell you, but the real cliff edge was actually explaining to people that they personally would have to be paying more for social care. And they didn't like it. As we heard from Steve, people are used in election campaigns to being told what they'll be given. Absolutely not used to having it set out to them that they might have to pay more, that these benefits might have to be put towards social care. And even those who really could afford to lose those payments often felt that this was a point of principle, that this was going to be somebody attacking them. It felt like a real loss. But of course, the issues around funding of social care and around those who are having home care, the way that would be funded, that was done extraordinarily clumsily, in my view. Instead of, as we heard, having a big debate about how we're going to pool the risk, it felt very clunky. There was no case made for why this was the right thing to do. And now, having been so badly stung by that, and having been told by the DUP that they wouldn't support it, there's no way that we can get some of these really major reforms through. So what we're going to do is we're going to, as we always do, send it down the line with lots more discussion and green papers, but will it actually get across the line? It will not get across the line without cross-party support. And I fear that support won't be there because the Labour Party is on a permanent election footing and wants to be in the position to promise everything to everyone. So I'm afraid we are very stuck. And so how are we going to get out of this mess? Well, I think there is a role for Parliament here and a role for the select committees. Because select committees have a tradition of cross-party working. And I very much hope that the liaison committee, when it's finally able to get up and running, will play a much more muscular role in trying to coordinate something of cross-party working to try and make it clear to both political leaders and to the public, to do that job of explaining why we have to get on and tackle this. And I think it needs to do that and to play a more muscular role precisely because all the energy of government is going to be consumed with Brexit and firefighting those short-term issues. You may feel, as and I think Steve is absolutely right, we're not going to get any health legislation, major health legislation. I personally think it's a good thing. The last thing we need is another major structural reform. I think we'd all agree on that. But there are some small but important pieces of legislation that would be very helpful around, for example, regularising STPs, giving them a statutory footing, about regulation. But anything that is going to be achieved will have to be achieved through secondary legislation. And so that's a missed opportunity, but also a good thing because it means we're not going to have any major reorganisation. So I think that's the picture. As somebody who's in Parliament at the moment watching this, it does feel very fragile. There are many divisions within all the political parties themselves which are being barely papered over. And so the internal party energy is also being consumed by that. So as I say, I think the way forward is for select committees and Parliament to take a greater role and to lead these discussions with the public. And one can only hope that even if those who do feel themselves on election footing, I very much hope that Jeremy Corbyn will himself think, if there's a serious possibility that I'm going to be in power, actually it's the right thing to do because these issues are not going to go away. And so that getting behind a reform that actually takes something from all the political parties, because no one has a monopoly on good ideas, I hope that he will see that that is in his interests, because it's certainly in the country's interests for us to try and move forward on this debate. Thank you.
Sarah, thank you. Before I invite Jill, Steve said that he thought the minority government couldn't afford for there to be a crisis. There could therefore be emergency injections of cash. Do you agree with that?
Because I think that's what we'll see. As we saw with social care, we saw an emergency injection, but that's not as effective, in my view, as having a planned, slow and sustainable growth.
Okay, thank you. So, Jill Rutter from the Institute for Government, please complete our presentations.
Okay, I'm going to stay sitting here. I hope that doesn't freak the live stream. If you can't see me on the live stream, I'm sitting over to the left. Just on that last point, actually, I just want to do a quick trail for something the Institute for Government's published today, which is our performance tracker here, has a big chapter on health and social care. But actually its big message is that one of the problems for the government, and this is a problem before the government lost its majority, was that it was trapped in this reactive cycle of injecting money at the last minute and actually sort of using money as sticking plasters in too many cases, rather than actually using it to get reform and actually put services onto a sustainable basis. And I think exactly what Sarah was saying, it looks like that's the highest risk option. Because actually one of the things that's interesting about minority government is money is what you can do in minority government. You can spend money. That is not difficult. One of your big problems in minority government is you spend money on things you otherwise wouldn't spend money on. So we saw very early on the sort of ambushes that the government suffered over funding abortions for women from Northern Ireland, over the haemophiliac inquiry and things like that. And you can do these things and actually, you know, you can start giving away £500 million here, £500 million there, whatever. And soon those sort of billions start adding up to quite serious money, even in fiscal terms. So money is what you can't do. Legislation is what you can do. Legislation, as others have said, is what you do absolutely, absolutely, absolutely as a last resort, which is why we saw possibly the weirdest Queen's speech ever for a newly elected government. I remember we had to wait while the deal with the DUP was finally sorted. It was actually a Queen's speech which had two halves. One half was the Brexit legislation, The other half basically was the things that are usually called private member handout bills, which are the list of sort of bits of boring business departments want to get done, but they can never get any space in any decent legislative programme. So when they find out who's top of the list for private members, they say, would you like to do this legislation on whiplash? It'll be all right, everybody will agree, the government won't oppose. And that's the sort of stuff we saw in the Queen's speech. So it didn't look like a Queen's speech that you would see from a newly elected government. The other thing, and here I'm slightly taking issue with Steve, the key thing about elections is not to box yourself in by what you commit to in elections. We all know we have deeply dishonest conversations in elections. The IFS will tell you that the normal thing you do straight after an election is you raise taxes. You know, that is the pattern. You try not to box yourselves in so you're not breaching your commitment, so you won't double VAT, but you put it up from 8 to 15%. That's one of you, for the older people in the room, remembering the first Conservative budget in 1979. Anyway, so we've lost that margin. I think the chance that the Chancellor will be able to do anything serious fiscally on the 22nd of November is more or less gone. I just wanted to give you a brief feel, since I'm here as the non-health expert, of what minority government feels like within government. It's actually quite interesting. I've been in governments which have sort of lost their majority for a bit. I was in number 10 actually doing health under the John Major government. Actually, for the civil service, minority government doesn't feel very different. Feels very, very different for parliamentarians. Coalition government was a very strange beast that people had to get used to, quite an interesting beast to get used to. But minority government, you've got, you know, ministers of all the same party, the normal sort of processes work. You'll find that the business managers are much more influential, or should be much more influential when ministers are deciding what they can do, because they're there saying we can't get that through, we can't get that through either, etc. The other thing you find is that your ministers are very preoccupied. Ministers are very tied to the parliamentary estate. Ministers have to be there. The pairing arrangements, I think, have still broken down. So everybody is under orders that they are to be nowhere other than in Parliament if there's any risk of an important vote at any time. And that's even with the government sort of not turning up for opposition days, with the exception of Dr. Wollaston yesterday on universal credit. So for the civil service, it doesn't actually feel that different. But one of the things that minority does, because of that, because of the constant pressure, because of the constant threat that the government might go down, is that it's a very energy-sapping experience. There's this background of there's potentially late nights. We don't know yet when the EU withdrawal bill will actually come to its committee stage in Parliament. We were sort of expecting it this week. I think we were sort of expecting it last week. Laura Kuenssberg yesterday was saying it's been delayed beyond the recess. When it comes, expect an awful lot of very tired MPs and ministers to be lurking around, because although the government's guaranteed 8 days, it doesn't seem very many to me, I have to say. I was slightly surprised Parliament when it has promised more time if necessary, and it has promised a minimum of 8 hours in each of those. So Parliament will be sad. There'll be a lot of tired people going, and that imposes a big what I think academics call a bandwidth tax on ministers, particularly the most senior ministers. So much space is taken up by thinking about that, managing that, living on knife edge, that the room you have to sit back and think about where do we go to just disappears. But I would argue that actually, from the point of view of NHS and social care, minority government is in many ways possibly the least of your problems. There's a huge big problem, I think, on money. I think one of the things about the election was actually the sort of austerity consensus is now frayed. There was a sort of consensus that there was a sort of game, and I think that's one of the things that makes it quite difficult now to think about the sort of cross-party things Sarah was talking about. Could you actually do a sort of consensus? If the other side is saying the answer is just to spend loads more money, it's much harder to have a conversation about how do you, and we actually don't care nearly as much as you did, you're wrong to care about the deficit, then it's much harder to actually have a sort of proper sort of cross-party engagement. I think it's a shame. I think the government should try. There's some really interesting figures of the pressure on the civil service. Civil service morale generally has been holding up quite well. The Department of Health is the big outlier. Department of Health between 2015 and 2016 saw its morale drop by, its engagement index drop by 12%. We will see the figures next year, for last year in November. One of the reasons was because they've had a massive redundancy round. People working in the Department of Health, maybe some moved to NHS England, not quite sure, but they've halved since 2010. So actually there's much less capacity that there was there. Within government, some people describe it as being like the Wild West now. Brexit is taking priority. I was at something where John Manzoni, the Chief Executive of the Civil Service, was speaking yesterday. He said, well, basically, governments have to do three things. They have to keep the show on the road, do business as usual. They have to do Brexit, whatever Brexit means. We're still not very clear about that because of this mad process we're in of simultaneously negotiating, legislating and implementing Brexit. It's not how you would do it in an ideally planned world, but that's what we've locked ourselves into. And the third thing you do is new stuff, because actually there's virtually no room for new stuff. The government has this great thing about we don't want to just be a Brexit government. I think more sensible voices saying that actually you really do have to be primarily a Brexit government because you've got no choice about that. But one of the things we see is, I don't know whether any of you noticed in the summer, people in government are now talking about Brexit affected and non-Brexit affected departments, frontline Brexit affected departments like DEFRA, the business department, the Home Office, HMRC. There was a call out in the summer to create a pool of 750 people available from non-DEFRA departments who could be redeployed to fill Brexit-created gaps at short notice. So at the moment, Whitehall is in a state of churn, turmoil. People say it's the Wild West out there. Moving jobs, so it's all quite a difficult, unstable environment of people under huge pressure to deliver. They're not quite sure what, and ministers distracted both by the minority government but also by the cabinet infighting. We had an event at the Institute for Government 2 days ago with a lot of foreign journalists who just said, you know, we just don't know what your government wants, whether there's any possibility of getting cabinet agreement on anything at the moment. It is giving out loads and loads of difficult signals. So it's a very difficult time. The good thing is, if people out there want to just get on and get out with it, the chances of political interference are much, much, much less than they normally would be. So that may be incredibly good news. This is a fantastically excellent time to show that the service can just get on and do it, and actually, you know, it's the politicians that create the problems.
Thank you. So I'm going to kick off. I'd like to ask all of our panellists the same question around the risks of instability with a minority government and what could be the cause of that, or causes of that instability, and the prospects therefore of another general election. Steve?
Personally, I think, Chris, there is only one scenario where there might be an early election. But before I come to that, let me say why I think it's much more likely that this Parliament will stagger on until 2022. That is partly the fixed-term Parliament. It means that the Parliament Act, it means Conservative MPs must want an election. That's how Theresa May pulled it off earlier this year. They thought they were going to win and voted for it. I can't see a scenario in the next few years where Conservative MPs will ache for another election. So one of the ironies of Jeremy Corbyn doing quite well in terms of the opinion polls is they stop him from becoming Prime Minister in an early election. I can see one scenario where it happens, which if there is no deal, I think the consequences, Brexit no deal, the consequences will be so seismic, I can see things imploding to a point where an election will be required to sort, well, not that it will sort it out, but will be an attempt to make some new shape of British politics.
I'd say it's easy to wound a minority government, but it's actually harder to kill it off. And for exactly the reasons that Steve has described, that we would have to be turkeys voting for Christmas to vote for an early election right now. I think the thing that would have triggered it would have been had we gone for a leadership election. And I think that one of the things that has come out of the party conference and an attempt by a small group of colleagues to try and force a leadership election had the opposite effect. Is it sort of meant that people did sort of come together to support the Prime Minister, because all of us, I think, well, the vast majority of us, feel that at this stage it would be hugely destabilising to have a leadership election and another general election at this stage in the Brexit negotiations. And many of us, myself included, actually feel that for all the clumsiness of the election campaign, that she is the right person to be leading us at this stage. So I think there won't be a leadership election now. I really don't. I think the government will continue. But I absolutely agree with Steve. I think if there is no deal, it will become very messy indeed.
Jill?
Minority governments are much more stable than you think. I mean, all our research says actually minority governments, we're just not used to them, in the same way as we weren't used to coalition. Actually, coalition gave us 5 years of amazing stability, actually, in retrospect. People governed as minorities for really quite some time. Canadians did it. Stephen Harper mainly did it by proroguing Parliament for quite long sessions. I think Parliament sat about 6 months of the year quite often. But there's no reason that a minority government should fall. And as Steve said, the irony was one of the manifesto commitments, I think, was to repeal the Fixed Term Parliaments Act. But that didn't appear in the Queen's speech. I sort of wonder why. Anyway.
And if there is no deal, do you agree with what has been said?
I think that could be, I mean, something that one of the interesting things is there something that triggers a sort of massive splitting on party lines or whatever. One of the things that was really interesting, I was in number 10 during Maastricht. I mean, one of the things there that was really interesting was that the Conservative Eurosceptics then actually cared much more about that issue than they did about the party. I think it's really interesting is whether you would get to any situation where you have sort of, serious Conservative Remainers deciding that there was a better future that would help them to bring down the government.
Yeah. And Sarah, just one other question for me, and then I am going to open it up. So you've mentioned the green paper, the promised green paper on social care, and have expressed your, I suppose, disappointment it isn't going to cover health as well as social care. What we're picking up from the fund is that progress on that is glacial, to be generous, at the moment. Which doesn't send out a very positive signal about the amount of time and attention this really important public policy issue is getting. What are the best prospects, do you think, for that green paper to begin to have to stimulate a sensible discussion?
Well, I think, as I say, pressure from Parliament itself and pressure from the public and the media to say, where is it? And I think that would have been much more likely if it had been health as well. I suspect this is going to continue to be kicked into the long grass simply because of all the energy being sucked out of the room until, as we heard before, we start to see another series of very high-profile crises within health and social care, and then it'll come back onto the agenda. But I wish it had a higher priority.
And will your committee be playing its part in that process?
Absolutely. and I think, as I said before, there is a role for the liaison committee, and for those of you who aren't familiar with the liaison committee, it's the committee of all the committee chairs, and it's the only committee in Parliament that can call the Prime Minister to give evidence. And one thing we did see in the last Parliament was increasingly committees working together on inquiries. So, for example, when many of us were campaigning for an increase in social care funding, it was the Health Committee, the Public Accounts Committee, the CLG Committee, and the DWP committees all working together, and the committee chairs working together to apply pressure, played a part in that. But as I say, I think that the real trigger for progress will be inevitably stories in the press this winter about failings in the NHS and social care because of the funding and workforce pressures that we face.
So let me turn it over to you. I can see we have a lot of experienced colleagues in the audience, including parliamentarians. Mary Ellen has the microphone. Let's start at the back. Philip, I think your hand was up, and then we'll come to the front.
Thank you very much. Thanks for this morning's discussion, which has been fascinating. Philip Hunt, I'm an opposition spokesman on health in the Lords. Can I just ask two quick questions? I mean, Jill suggested that the political situation will give more space to the NHS than it might have. Can I just ask her and the panel, we've got these STPs which, on the face of it, are proposing what might be considered controversial changes locally. Do you think that the current situation makes it more likely that, in fact, people can get on with it in the NHS, or actually, do we have a risk-averse system at the moment where actually there will be central interventions when any proposal is likely to cause trouble? The second question is about this resources, your long-term resource as opposed to emergency funding. The FCA's got a great, very interesting report about intergenerational fairness, which is a current jargon. But looking at the politics of over the next 10 years, given that health and social care is mainly devoted to older people, do you not think that governments actually are going to prioritise younger people? And that actually, realistically, the chances of a kind of long-term funding solution for health and social care, which would mean more resources from the taxpayer, is actually pretty remote.
Okay. So a hand on the left-hand side, the lady who's typing away on her iPad. You wanted to come in?
Yeah, actually, only to ask Philip's question, really. I wonder too whether SGPs might benefit from neglect, and I'd be very interested to know what you, Chris, and Sarah think about it. You know,
yes.
how well they're developing.
So please tell us who you are.
Oh, I'm so sorry, Anne Perkins from the Guardian.
Yeah. And there was a hand I saw on this side, Joe, isn't it? Yes.
Joe Farrington, Douglas Senior Strategy Advisor at King's College Hospital. The way that you've all spoken, because it's true, is that Brexit is consuming everything, and health and social care can't kind of get its word in edgeways. But of course, in the referendum, the NHS was on the side of the bus, and as a frontline hospital, we're already seeing the impacts of sort of pre-Brexit in terms of the chilling effect on recruitment and costs already rising and costs of pharmaceuticals going up. So should the health and social care sort of system be trying to get itself part of the Brexit debate much more, and if so, how?
Okay, and let me say one more from Sigurd here at the front, and we'll get some responses.
Sigurd Ranton, Ned at NHSI, and I must emphasise that the question I'm about to put is not on behalf of the institution. It's rather a question that's triggered by the, I thought, fascinating analysis that the three of you provided. If it is the case that we are now bound to be in a period of semi-paralysis, but that the government will react to clear and evident and present crises by throwing money at it, might we see a scenario where the proportion of adult social care that is de facto funded via the NHS, that we already have, and it's quite a large part of the total that's not funded through local authorities, but indirectly through people either staying inside NHS institutions, i.e. in beds where they should be, or even many provider trusts are of course buying capacity outside the hospital for exactly the same purpose. Might we see, by stealth, the merging of the two by, in effect, the government funding the NHS to do more of this and taking control, perhaps via the STPs, God only knows. And is this in fact an opportunity to, by stealth, do what I think the three of you have been suggesting?
Which might be reinforced by the standoff between the government and local authorities over the funding of the Better Care Fund, delayed transfers. Okay. Steve, on Philip Hunt's question on intergenerational fairness, and there'll be some well-briefed leaks ahead of a budget on what might be coming up there.
Yeah, no, it's a brilliant question, and it's complicated. There's absolutely no doubt as far as there is any thinking within government outside Brexit, it is how to woo younger people, younger voters. They were traumatised by the overturning of all assumptions that young people didn't vote. They did, and they voted Labour, and they've got a huge problem and potentially growing one. So they will throw policies, perhaps clunkily, aimed at younger voters. But where social care, I think, becomes more complicated than that is if you count younger voters. Labour did well with the under 40s. Well, I know loads of people under 40 obsessed with social care and the fear of having to look after elderly people and the costs and so on. So actually, it is an issue which touches a much wider number than the elderly person. But you've got to frame the arguments and prepare the ground. And extraordinarily, as Sarah suggested, just to announce it in an election manifesto, a policy that itself hadn't been thought through, was the opposite of all of that.
Jill, what are your thoughts?
I think it's, at the moment it looks as though it's sort of going to be more potentially on the sort of debts payment side. Actually, there's sort of we've seen things floated like writing off student debt, or do we have some sort of tweaking of age tax? I think the thing that I always thought was a huge shame about Andrew Dilnot's attempt at doing social care was that he didn't go one stage further and to say to old people, actually, this is actually about you. Why? How would you like to pay for that? And I thought it was, we looked and said no money for it. But the Chancellor, if you looked at the money the Chancellor gave away in inheritance tax exemption on the principal property, which was a ridiculous fiscal proposition, apologies Sarah, it was an absolutely absurd proposition to just privilege one sort of asset to one sort of beneficiaries. That was £1 billion. I mean, when it starts to accumulate up, that actually starts to make a bit of a dent in some of your problems. So I think there's a conversation about who pays that we need to have. And that's actually why I think the government doing a green paper is a seriously missed opportunity. Because if you accept that pace is going to be glacial and you're not going to do major reform, what the government should do, both on the tax side, I think, and on the spending side, is to say, okay, we're not going to be able to do very much. The big useful thing we can do is contract out some of these. Whether it's to a sort of parliamentary inquiry like we had on banking under Andrew Tyree, so ask Sarah to head up a parliamentary commission on health and social care, or do a sort of Turner-style review and start actually building your evidence base, building some consensus. So when you might have a majority back and you're not just doing Brexit, 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 you've actually got some really good, well-formed proposals you might actually be able to do something with. And it seems to me just put out another green paper that will get into lost in under the radar is an absolute waste of time and effort, basically, she said.
In the absence of any progress on the green paper, policy wonks in the audience, myself included, may have seen a very interesting blog by John Godfrey. He used to be in the number 10 policy unit, which I think was on the Politics Home website, setting out some quite detailed and very interesting proposals for how a different funding approach to social care, indeed health and social care, might be pursued on the back of the debacle around the manifesto commitment. So it's worth tracking that down and seeing what somebody who knows about these issues is thinking. Sarah, quite a few questions really related to your area of expertise, not least Sigurd's and the issues around STPs.
I think the difficulty for STPs is that they're being increasingly viewed as a vehicle for cuts, and that's a great tragedy because, of course, the potential with STPs was to genuinely return to sort of area-based commissioning for a population, getting away from the purchaser-provider split, getting away from endless contracting rounds and transaction costs in the NHS. So, but because of the financial difficulties that they all face, that is how they are increasingly being seen. And of course, the Labour Party branding them STP's secret Tory plans. And there have been some own goals from the NHS around STPs, and principally around the sort of kind of the failure to properly consult with local authorities. And the failure to consult with local representatives. I found it very discouraging that as a Health Select Committee chair, a former clinician and a local MP, I had several people within the system talking to me about their concerns about things like the capped expenditure process, but telling me that I couldn't quote them, I couldn't say they'd spoken to me, feeling genuinely fearful about their positions. That's totally unacceptable. So we've got to see much greater transparency from the NHS, and we're still waiting for the promised letter setting out explicitly that people should be free to talk to their local representatives, which was promised to me that letter would go out, still waiting to see it, because we must have transparency and for people to be able to understand as representatives what those plans are, and for them to be co-produced, as the King's Fund has commented many times. If you co-produce these plans from the earliest stage, then they're much more likely to be a success. So there are things that the NHS needs to do, there are things that the political system needs to do to make these more successful.
And Sigurd's point about, will we see by stealth the NHS begin to pay more of the costs of social care, as is happening in some places?
Yes, I think we will. But of course that then brings you up against the issues of a service that's free at the point of use with a service that is not, and you know how that is going to work. If you actually pay, it is cheaper, of course, for the NHS to, when somebody is ready for discharge, if there isn't a social care funding or placement, to actually pay directly for them to be in social care. But for how long does that extend? And then what happens next? We also know that one of the reasons that can actually contribute to a delayed discharge is families being resistant to people moving. If the NHS then moves them with a fixed period at which they're responsible, do we then again find families saying, well, no, I've got to take over in 2 weeks, I'm not happy with that. So there are lots of issues we need to have honest conversations about.
Yes. And I think, interesting, if we go down that route, we will end up, again, by stealth, introducing criteria. I mean,
yes.
As you know, at the moment, de facto, these decisions are taken not strictly on clinical grounds. People take the whole situation into account.
Yeah.
But it's not made explicit anywhere.
Yeah. So if I could just add a thought on the STP process, which links the two questions. I think there are some areas that are making real progress in moving from planning to the implementation of what STPs were proposing. So I'd give Dorset as a leading example of that, where one of the big ideas in their STP was to have a debate about Bournemouth Hospital and Poole Hospital, one of them becoming the emergency hospital, one becoming more of the planned care hospital. They've been through a big public consultation exercise, and my understanding is they've now got broad agreement on making Bournemouth the hot site and Poole the cold site. And of course that didn't just start with the STP, there's been a debate in Dorset over a long period of time which has been brought together in the STP, but that looks like it's now going to happen. Another example would be around the Greater Manchester STP, which had a head start on the rest of the country because their plan was approved 12 months before the idea of STPs even emerged. And they've done some really good work on improving access to primary care, developing their mental health strategy across the whole of the conurbation, and then at a more local level in places like Tameside and Salford and Bolton, developing, well, the beginning of more integrated health and care systems. But obviously there are particular characteristics of Greater Manchester around the history of joint working between the local authorities over many, many years, which is why they're in the vanguard on the devolution process. And Jill, I just wanted to ask you on that. Devolution, George Osborne was very much leading this. Is it still alive, or is it something of the past?
I think it would be fair to say, and Sarah will have a better feel for this, that there's not much energy behind further devolution at the moment, and that seems to sort of gone quite cold. But I mean, the one thing we do have, and I think this is a really interesting opportunity, is we do have those metro mayors who were elected. So we have Andy Burnham, Andy Street, or I think there are some people who aren't called Andy, no women unfortunately, but running our sort of big conurbations. I think that Manchester, you know, because Manchester has actually got more devolution in some of these areas than anywhere else. So I think that's really interesting. You know, can they do, you know, interesting new things and pave a path for when, you know, so basically they've got a sort of 4-year period to justify, you know, whether this experiment was worth doing, given how poorly rooted in sort of local consent the idea of mayors was after they were imposed in most areas as part of the devolution deals. But I don't think that the Treasury, which was basically a big driver under George Osborne, you know, ministers, whatever, is quite driving any of this in the same way as it was before George Osborne left. But they are there now, so yeah, they're making progress.
In the context of the STPs and what are now being called these accountable care systems, there was an announcement about Surrey, what's called Surrey Heartlands, being another example of devolution, but another of the accountable care systems up in South Yorkshire and Bassetlaw when I was there about a month ago. Difficulty in getting the local authorities, you know, Sheffield and the old South Yorkshire coalfield areas to agree on what that might mean, which is why Greater Manchester is so different. You know, there is that consensus among the politicians, the local politicians. Any thoughts on devolution?
Well, of course, people are always wanting greater local decision making until a local decision is made they don't agree with, and then they're coming to my surgeries and saying, why aren't I stepping in? And it's because actually no, this is a decision made by your local area, and of course you then get all the arguments about postcode lotteries. One person's local decision making is another person's postcode lottery, depending on which side of the line you fall. So no, and people are going to find that they're unhappy with decisions just as they are now. And of course, above all that, there's the financial realities in which they'll have to operate. But I'd say about Manchester is Manchester had a long tradition of close working, and that's probably why it will be successful. If you plant that system in an area that doesn't have a culture of close working across health and social care, don't expect it to work, and that's the issue we're going to face.
Okay, good. So let's have another
Should we
round.
take the Brexit question?
Oh yes, thank you.
Since I was going to, so you were asking about what you can do about Brexit. Other people will have views. I mean, there are lots of select committee inquiries on Brexit. Lots and lots and lots of select committee inquiries on Brexit, both by the EU committee, by departmental select committees and whatever. There's supposed to be a migration paper this autumn, which you will want to have a very close look at and see what's being proposed in that, in terms of whether there's proposals sectoral visas, how that's coping. There's also the call for evidence from the Migration Advisory Committee, who's been commissioned by Amber Rudd to do 2 reports, one on sort of the contribution of EEA nationals and the other about overseas students. So highly recommend that they've got calls of evidence out there, so highly recommend that you or NHS employers or whatever get seriously stuck in, because when we had Brandon Lewis speaking at an event, Conservative Party conference, he said that actually we said, isn't that a bit late? One might argue it's years and years too late. He said, well, actually, those are what we're going to use to inform the secondary legislation that we will bring forward towards the end of 2018 to introduce the new system. So those are really important. You obviously need to get stuck into discussions, if you can, on futures of medicines regulation, EMA, all of that. One of the interesting things on trade agreements is that this becomes quite an interesting set of issues. When we looked at capacity within Whitehall to deal with trade, one of the departments that we perceived to be forming its trade expertise less fast than others was the Department of Health. And health will be quite a major player on things, both about how procurement rules might affect the NHS, which is clearly quite a big issue, it's a massive issue, things like TTIP, but also on sort of pharmaceuticals, which are always a big chapter in conventional trade agreements. So there's quite a lot to be done. I think it's quite interesting for some of these sort of big health organisations to think how they're going to really sort of start influencing those sort of non-directly health policy debates, because you will be on the receiving end otherwise, and a bit of collateral damage on of policies that no one particularly vote leave to have fewer overseas nurses and things like that. But you are going to be on the receiving end of whatever. So start building your evidence bases and get stuck in.
You've been warned. So there's a hand, 2 or 3 hands towards the back. Are there any over on this side too, just in the spirit of intergenerational fairness? So gentleman at the back.
Rob Sneed, I run the medical and dental schools in Plymouth. On Friday last week I was in Sarah's constituency seeing spectacular examples of integrated health and social care, and I'm associated with 2 STPs, both of which are trying really hard to join things up. But all of this is in the context of the 2010 Health and Social Care Bill, which was specifically designed to prevent exactly the things that people are trying to achieve. And people are slightly paralysed by fear of judicial review, by predatory private providers looking to pick off bits of things that people are trying to put together. So my question for the panel is, given that we're not going to get any new primary legislation to change this ineffective law, or obstructive law, can you suggest some cool workarounds to help CCGs, STPs and providers have more confidence in doing the things that they want to do but feel inhibited from doing because the law makes it difficult?
I think Simon Stevens said to your committee that about 85% of what needs to be done can be done within the existing framework. He didn't tell us what the 15% was.
No, we did press.
So go figure is the answer. So hand Mary Allen just a bit further in front.
Hi, Leonora from the Nuffield Trust. I'm interested in coming back to this issue about kind of how organisations might tackle some of this impasse that we've been talking about and what the role might be for experts. I don't know if it's to do with minority government, but we've definitely noticed there's been an increasing use, I won't say fake news, but perhaps alternative facts. I noticed yesterday the Department for Health put out a tweet in response to the BBC's hospital tracker, which suggested that actually cancer treatment was being met within 2 weeks, which is a fairly creative use of that particular target. So how do we as expert organisations whose role it is to put evidence forward actually tackle some of this kind of here's one fact, here's another, you know, and it kind of creates this sense that no one really knows anything. So what role do we have?
Okay, thank you. And there's a hand right at the back.
Good morning. Paul Kelso with Sky News. Just a question to Sarah and others in relation to what you said about the profile and attention to the social care green paper. Are you effectively saying it's the case not that the best chance for getting more attention is a truly catastrophic winter that gets us all broadcasting stories about deaths on wards? And one quick word about language. I wonder if Steve might have an observation about. I'm relatively new journalistically to this beat, and much of it is shrouded in euphemism. Social care is a fabulously useful phrase for everyone in this room to understand what we're talking about it, but I'm not sure how impactful it is to all those under 40s, you know, Steve, who are obsessed with it, but I don't know many, and there is, I wonder if some more direct language might get everyone more engaged with this subject.
Bring back George Orwell, I think, is the message, isn't it? What about the role of experts, Steve?
Well, I'll tell you, I completely agree with you about the sort of eruption of false statistics and all the rest of it, and there's nothing any of us can do about it. The social media revolution is not controllable as far as I can see. But to be optimistic for 10 seconds, I think there are several arenas where you and others can get your voice heard. One is via Parliament. I think what's interesting about the current situation is the degree to which Parliament is becoming more assertive. My sort of political upbringing as a journalist was in landslide governments where Parliament was totally irrelevant and select committees were kind of peripheral bodies. Sarah mentioned, the way that the select committee chairs are beginning to liaise more intensely, and they are forensic and reasoned. And if you look at the chairs, Sarah, Yvette Cooper, Hilary Benn, these people, Nicky Morgan, and these, I think, will be powerful figures and institutions in this debate to come. And Parliament itself, if you look at the way different groups are liaising, Ken Clarke and Chris Leslie from Labour side putting amendments down on this current Brexit bill, one of the reasons why it's been delayed. So I think Parliament is going to acquire much greater significance, and in that significance there is routes through for genuine experts trying to communicate. And also there are media platforms, including the broadcasters, who will respond, but to absolutely agree the language has to be accessible. I haven't got friends who are obsessed, by the way, aged 40, about social care, and you're right, social care, what does it mean? The language needs to be much more accessible when communicating to any audience outside this room, and probably in this room, and I completely agree with you about that.
What's your take on the role of the experts, Jill?
I think they're experts and then they're doctors, actually, is quite interesting, because I think when Michael Gove made his famous expert comment, he was basically slagging off economists, all the initiatives and organisations he was having a go at. And it wasn't particularly expertise, it was forecasts. And forecasting is notoriously difficult. So, and forecasts is only always a question of how wrong they are. Forecasts are very rarely right. So, one of the things that's very difficult, I think, and particularly acutely difficult about being health secretary, is that you start at a huge, big credibility deficit versus doctors and nurses. And you see that whenever you look at things like the Ipsos Mori. Veracity Index, I think people over-trust doctors. Sarah on the panel, I'm very sceptical of doctors. I think the BMA, my niece is on one of the committees, but I think the BMA is over to Ken Clark's view, it's an incredibly effective closed shop pursuing doctors rather than health interests or whatever. But anyway, take that to another place. But I think doctors are usually very credible in telling people, like I say, people are much more likely to believe them. I think it's a great role, and I'm going to give a call out. Claire from Full Fact is in the audience, Claire Milne. Full Fact do a great job calling out duff data as soon as it's used and forcing Department of Health onto a back foot, and I think that there is a real role for sort of all those people who are interested in having a better quality debate, ensuring that these sort of zombie facts are taken out at the first moment rather than sort of infecting the debate, because if you let a zombie start roaming, it goes away and you just get debates on the wrong footing. So so donate to Full Fact, she said.
And on that point, if you remember the greatest sort of non-fact of the referendum campaign was on the side of that bus, 350 million a week for the NHS, which Vote Leave knew to be false. But their view was it didn't matter, you just had to keep repeating the number, because the more you repeated it and the more there was a debate about it, actually the more people just remembered the number. And that is in fact what happened, is that afterwards when people said what was the thing you most remembered, it was 350 million a week on the side of the bus. And so the work that, as say Full Fact do, it needs to be headed off as soon as possible, rather than allowing it to gain traction.
Yeah. Can I just say on that 10 seconds, if there is a Brexit backer Prime Minister in 2022 at an election, I think they will feel compelled to make a big commitment on NHS spending. I don't see how they will pretend it's because of Brexit, but they will have to maintain that pretense. I don't think they can go into that election without that commitment. Anyway, just a thought.
What about the question on the challenge to STPs that the colleague from Plymouth raised, Sarah?
Yes, well, I mean, the Health Select Committee in the last Parliament was known as the Torbay Committee at times, because we very often referred to examples of good joint working, and it seems to be happening in spite of the legislation. Personally, I'd always hoped that there would be a greater role for Monitor Now NHS Improvement in organisations having a bit of cover to take forward these kinds of sensible, integrated decision making without fearing that they're going to face legal challenge.
Can I say something just about that particular point, if I can have the mic? The process is, of course, that the CMA, if they are called upon, seek our advice before they come to their decision, and we will look at what we regard to be in patients' best interest, which has allowed many of these things to actually go through. So whilst it can be annoying and you might wish that you could change the legislation, we're trying to work with it.
And one of the things that came up during the passage of the Health and Social Care Act when then Secretary of State came to the committee, I asked him on a number of occasions, can integration trump competition? And I was told yes, it could. So yes, that is what he said.
Okay, let's take one final round of questions. I think, Will, I saw your hand up at the back.
Thanks, Chris, and panel. Will Cavendish, currently independent until recently working on artificial intelligence, deep knowledge before that, which is health. It's been quite a sort of downbeat morning, generally. So I just thought I'd try and be heterodox and try and sort of think about what are the upsides for the next 5 years. And having worked in government, the big complaint the NHS makes all the time is that ministers meddle too much and they underfund the service. And one of the things about minority government is ministers are less able to meddle on a daily basis, and it's more difficult to impose really hard spending limits, because we're seeing that something has to give. So the sort of service-wide level, it's a little bit more positive than perhaps on my analysis. At the same time, you see lots of quite interesting things happening that we've now started to talk about at a local level, in the health service, through the STP, getting it right first programme, the global digital exemplars. There are really things happening. It's patient work, but we know it's patient work to develop the kind of integrated care models that are needed, and I feel that's happening more positively than it has happened for the last decade, 15 years than previously. At the same time, in social care, you're seeing actually an incredible amount of innovation happening in social care, partly because everybody knows the funding situation is really challenging. So I've met, in the last 6 months, a whole range of organisations doing some really interesting stuff in social care, developing new care models, new engagement models and so on. So, I just thought, is there an opportunity to think a little bit more about what might happen positively over the next 3 to 5 years, even though, of course, we're in a rather difficult situation at the moment, you know, while this government places that out.
So while the microphone's out, I'm going to point the finger at Jeff Alltimes, who's sitting very close to you. Jeff, do you agree with that more upbeat assessment, and particularly your experience, long experience in local government as well as working with the NHS?
I certainly don't respond to the panel discussion in quite such an optimistic way as Will is. I do agree with the points. I'm currently involved in the London Devolution programme, and I do believe that that is the main way in which we are going to see some progress in the way that some of the panel discussion has referred to. I'd like to see the Health Select Committee, Sarah, working with Manchester and Andy Burnham about what may happen where they've got that great alignment of devolution and their STP. I mean, mainly with all my previous experience on the sort of health and social care integration picture, I think the only way we're going to see progress is at the local level. I think there are a few examples that we've heard about from today. I'd like to see the NHS a little bit more up for looking at how we work collaboratively. I think the next round of discussions in relation to STPs needs the NHS to be more willing to talk to the local government side about how to make it work with them. And obviously, Chris, you were involved in that work in London on that process.
Yeah, so thanks. And Matthew, we'll give you the last question and then come back to our panel and summarise our discussions.
Matthew Kershaw, Senior Fellow here at the King's Fund. Building on those last 2 points, clearly most commentators and those people working in the health service would see most of the problems and difficulties at a system level rather than individual organisation level, and indeed the solutions at that level too. What do the panel think is likely to happen? Is it going to be a change of debate with the neglect possibility that you're talking about, that systems can get on and develop things together, or is there going to be a continued focus on individual organisations and their specific performance as seen by the BBC tracker that was much publicised yesterday?
So why don't you start us on that, Sarah, the future of system working in particular?
Well, to try and answer 2 points, in fact, just before the election, the Health Select Committee in the last Parliament had agreed to undertake an inquiry into STPs to look at all of these kinds of issues. We'll be having our meeting shortly to discuss our future programme. We're about to start an inquiry now into the nursing workforce, and then to look at Brexit, the impact on products and devices, but then we'll be meeting to consider our long-term programme. Now, I as chair don't make the decision about what the committee will look at. I can help to draw up the list and put the case for various inquiries, but ultimately it's down to the committee members to decide which of those they want to prioritise. So I'm afraid I can't individually promise you that, but I can tell you I agree that it is a very important issue that the Health Committee could usefully look at to address the very points that you have raised, that actually how do we enable this system-wide working to take place? What role can we play in trying to make sure that 15% that we heard from Simon Stevens that they do need to have legislative support for, that we can assist in that, in making the case for that, but also the 85% that could happen is happening everywhere, not just in a few isolated cases. I hope that's answered your question.
And in your neck of the woods, in the amusingly entitled Success Regime programme in Devon, there is some movement, isn't there, towards system working. I was reading the other day about how the system is supporting Derriford Hospital in Plymouth around some of the staffing questions.
Yes, that's right.
Jill and Steve, your final reflections on what you've been hearing today.
Sure, shall I go first? On Will's point, I was trying to say actually there is a potential opportunity, if the health service can get on with it. The danger is though that I always remember when I was in number 10, I used to attend the Secretary of State's meetings, and we had a health minister who'd been chairman of whatever construct you had in health back in the 1990s. Chris will remember when it was, but Baroness Cumberledge said, oh yes, we used to always think it was useful to declare a crisis in August because we thought that would help you in the spending round. And Virginia Bottom just looked and said, what? Anyway, but I think it's quite important that the NHS sort of doesn't entirely focus on thinking if we basically just cry out, there will be more money every time we do that, because politicians' reflex is just to write the cheque. So I think it's really helpful if people can focus on how can we actually manage our way out of these problems, and where can we innovate, where can we do things interestingly, rather than just decide let's just declare failure as soon and as often as possible, and look for the cheques to come from a sort of government that can't do anything else. So I think it'd be a really good mindset to get into. I just wanted to say one thing that's not been mentioned at all today, and where I think some of the real vulnerability is. One of the things that I hate about the health debate in this country is we equate health with the NHS. Health goes hugely wider than the NHS. Where is the first place you go to whenever the NHS wants more money? It's money that's being spent on non-NHS health programmes, so prevention, wider policies and whatever. That's the real vulnerability. If you really care about health, the thing you need to do is make sure those programmes aren't the first point everybody turns to for cuts when you need to stick a little bit more money to get that waiting list line down, turning down slightly. And I think that that is something that everybody in this room ought to really care and look out for.
Just very briefly, but I think it answers a couple of points. I think devolution of power within the NHS, like with local government at times, is viewed with great ambiguity, especially in the Treasury. Actually, I always quote something Tony Blair said at a local government conference when he was Prime Minister. He said to them, "We will give away more power as long as you use that power responsibly." Now, if you think about it, that raises 1,000 questions. Who decides what's responsible? And that is the attitude. I think George Osborne was keen on Manchester. He hit it off with the chief executive. He was keen on all the rest of it in Northern Powerhouse. But even there, it was ambiguous, and I think it would be very incremental. And that is partly because they know in the British culture, i.e. in the British London-based government, will be held responsible if anything goes wrong. And I think that answers your point at optimism. You are right to some extent that there will be more space now, and there will not be endless ministerial initiatives. But if there is a sense of crisis, or if there are local Conservative MPs worried about a local initiative and they go to the Department of Health and the Health Secretary senses it's going to be a story, there will be interventions galore, but they will be more piecemeal, because Jeremy Hunt does not want to be on the Today programme at 8:10 explaining a cock-up which he might have had no direct involvement for but ends up being responsible for. And that is the endless dance around British politics and the National Health Service.
Thank you, Steve. So just to say finally that we have our next breakfast event on the 6th of December, which we think will be about the implications of the budget for the future of health and social care, so chapter 2 of today's story. And then this is the update on our much loved and much viewed guide, alternative guide to the NHS in England, which is now on the website. So please take a look at it, tell us what you think. I think it's widely seen as a very helpful, simple way of understanding the huge complexity in the system that we're all trying to engage with. And please would you join me in thanking our 3 contributors for parliamentarians there, more important. You can rotate that in slightly different ways, won't you?
I think the point about voting against the government last night,
So, just quoting Jones.